What do you do when you meet a monster that has ruled the battlefield for 3 years, a machine so feared that entire Allied tank companies refused to engage it directly? The German Tiger tank was not just a weapon, it was psychological warfare on treads. Its 80mm gun could penetrate any Allied armor at ranges where return fire was suicide, but in the frozen towns of Germany in early 1945, something new rolled off the transport ships, something the Wehrmacht had not planned for. The M26 Pershing heavy tank arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet promise. The age of Tiger supremacy was about to end. This is the story of the day German tank crews stopped laughing, the day American steel finally hit back with equal force, and the moment one engagement near Cologne Cathedral changed the narrative of armored warfare forever. This is about the men who climbed into those Pershings, knowing they might not come home, but also knowing they carried something their brothers in Shermans never had, a fighting chance. February 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing, but it is collapsing violently, like a wounded animal backed into a corner. The Allies have crossed the Rhine in some places, but German resistance remains fanatical. Their tank crews, though outnumbered and running low on fuel, still possess the most feared armor in the European theater. The Tiger Bjorn, with its nearly impenetrable frontal armor and devastating 88mm KWK-36 gun, has achieved an almost mythical status. Allied tankers call encounters with Tigers meetings with death. Standard doctrine when spotting a Tiger is simple. Call in artillery, call in air support. Do not engage directly unless you have 5-to-1 numerical superiority, and even then, expect casualties. The American answer to German heavy armor has been until now not technological superiority, but numerical overwhelming. The M4 Sherman, reliable and mass-produced, fights Tigers the way wolves fight bears, in packs, accepting losses, flanking when possible. American tank crews know their 75mm guns are useless against Tiger frontal armor beyond 300 yards. They know the Tiger can kill them from twice that range. They climb into their Shermans anyway, because that is what duty demands. But something shifts in February 1945. The first 20 M26 Pershing heavy tanks arrive in Europe, assigned to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. These machines represent 3 years of American engineering debate, bureaucratic resistance, and urgent battlefield necessity finally converging. The Pershing mounts a 90mm gun, carries frontal armor up to 4 inches thick, and weighs 46 tons, finally approaching the Tiger's weight class. But here is what matters. On March 6, 1945, in the shattered streets of Cologne, Pershing No. 26, under the command of Sergeant Nicholas Maschlonik, encounters a German Panther tank at point-blank range. The engagement lasts seconds. The Pershing fires. The Panther explodes. A combat cameraman captures the entire sequence on film, and that footage becomes one of the most viewed pieces of tank combat documentation in history. For the first time, American tank crews watch footage of one of their own machines meeting German heavy armor on equal terms and winning decisively. The psychological impact ripples through armored units faster than any training manual could. The Pershing story begins not with glory, but with bureaucratic resistance and strategic miscalculation. In 1942, American military doctrine holds that tank destroyers, not heavy tanks, should counter enemy armor. Tanks are supposed to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry. The tank destroyer force receives priority funding. Meanwhile, Army Ground Forces Commander General Leslie McNair believes heavy tanks are unwieldy and unnecessary. He points to the Sherman's reliability and producibility. He believes the war will be won by combined arms coordination, not armor duels. He is both right and catastrophically wrong. Combat reports from North Africa in 1943 tell a different story. American tankers report feeling outgunned and outmatched when facing German Tigers and Panthers. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who will later become Army Chief of Staff, describes the psychological effect. When you know the enemy tank can kill you from 1,000 yards, and you cannot hurt him until 300, you do not think about tactics. You think about survival. Field commanders begin demanding better tanks. The Ordnance Department responds with the T-26 heavy tank project, which will eventually become the Pershing. But development crawls. Weight requirements keep changing. The 90mm gun requires a larger turret, which requires a stronger suspension, which adds weight, which requires a more powerful engine. Each solution creates new problems. Meanwhile, production priority remains with the Sherman, which can be built in enormous numbers. General Dwight Eisenhower, reviewing the specifications in late 1943, makes a fateful decision. Do not disrupt Sherman production. The T-26 project continues, but slowly, as a backup option, not a priority. Then comes the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German Tigers and Panthers savage American armored columns in the Ardennes. The disparity in tank capability becomes impossible to ignore. Entire Sherman platoons are destroyed by single Tiger tanks operating from concealed positions. After-action reports describe American tank crews abandoning their vehicles before engaging because they know engagement equals death. The psychological damage is as severe as the tactical losses. General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, sends urgent cables requesting immediate deployment of the T-26, now redesignated the M26 Pershing. The bureaucratic dam breaks. Production accelerates. By February 1945, the first Pershings reach frontline units. The men assigned to crew these new machines face their own contradictions. They want better armor and firepower, but they also know the Pershing is unproven. It is heavier than the Sherman, less maneuverable, more mechanically complex. Its Continental R975 engine is underpowered for the tank's weight, making it slower and prone to mechanical strain. The crews must learn new fire control systems, different ammunition handling procedures, and operating characteristics unlike anything they have trained on. They must do this while under fire during active combat operations with minimal technical support. And they must trust that this new machine will protect them better than the Shermans they are leaving behind. At its core, the Pershing's deployment represents a fundamental shift in American military philosophy. The admission that technological parity matters, that sometimes you cannot substitute numbers and determination for capability. The Sherman's nickname among German tankers is revealing, Tommy Cooker or Ronson after the lighter, because it lights up first time every time. Sherman crews know their tanks can brew up, catch fire and cook the crew when penetrated, because ammunition is stored in the hull with inadequate protection. The Pershing addresses this with wet ammunition storage, surrounding shells with water-filled jackets to prevent fires. This simple engineering choice saves lives, but the Pershing's significance transcends engineering specifications. It represents a psychological recalibration. For 3 years, American tankers have fought with a fundamental understanding. We are outgunned, so we must outthink, outflank, and outnumber. This creates both courage and trauma. Courage because men climb into Shermans knowing the odds. Trauma because those odds include watching friends burn when their tank is hit. The Pershing changes the equation. Not completely. It is not invincible, but enough that American crews begin engagements thinking about victory rather than survival. Consider the 90mm gun's capabilities. Against a Tiger-wise frontal armor at 500 yards, the Pershing can penetrate. The reverse is also true. The Tiger can penetrate the Pershing, but now the engagement is mutual. This parity transforms tactics. Sherman crews are trained to avoid frontal engagements with heavy German armor. Pershing crews are trained to seek them. The tank's gun mantlet carries 4.5 inches of armor. The glacis plate angles at 46 degrees, increasing effective thickness. The turret rotates electrically with a backup manual system. These are not just technical features. They are psychological anchors that tell the crew, you can fight this battle. The tension between American mass production philosophy and German quality-focused engineering finds its resolution in the Pershing. The Germans build technological marvels, Tigers with nearly impenetrable armor, Panthers with superior optics, King Tigers that dominate any battlefield they reach. But these machines are complex, expensive, and produced in limited numbers. By 1945, Germany fields perhaps 200 operational heavy tanks. America, by contrast, begins Pershing production thinking not in hundreds, but in thousands. The plan calls for building a tank good enough to fight German armor, while simple enough to maintain in field conditions, and numerous enough to affect battlefield outcomes. This is a distinctly American approach to warfare, practical superiority through scalable competence. The Cologne engagement on March 6th becomes legendary precisely because it is documented. Combat cameraman Jim Bates is filming 3rd Armored Division operations when Pershing 26, nicknamed Fireball, rounds a corner and encounters a Panther tank at approximately 75 yards range. Neither crew expects the other. The Panther crew spots the Pershing first and traverses their gun, But Sergeant Maslenik's gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, is faster. The Pershing's first 90mm round strikes the Panther's turret. The second round, fired 4 seconds later, penetrates the hull. The Panther explodes, its ammunition cooking off. The entire engagement lasts less than 10 seconds. What makes this moment transcendent is not just the tactical victory, but what it represents. An American medium to heavy tank meeting a German heavy tank in an urban knife fight and winning decisively through superior crew training and adequate equipment. The footage spreads through American armored units. Men who have spent months terrified of German heavy armor watch one of their new tanks kill a Panther at point-blank range. The psychological effect is transformative, but the Pershing's combat record in World War II is necessarily limited by its late arrival. Only 20 Pershings see combat in Europe before the German surrender. They participate in engagements around Cologne, the Ruhr Pocket, and the final drives into central Germany. Their documented kills include Panthers, Panzer Vs, and at least one Tiger Bakis. More importantly, they change how German crews engage American armor. German tankers, accustomed to American Shermans retreating when spotted, find Pershings advancing instead. The psychological dynamic inverts. The tank's real test comes not in Europe, but in Korea 5 years later. When North Korean T-34-85 tanks roll south in June 1950, American forces initially deploy M24 Chaffee light tanks, whose 75mm guns are ineffective against T-34 armor. Pershings, redesignated M26, deploy urgently. At Chinju in July 1950, Pershings of the 8th Cavalry Regiment engage T-34s at ranges between 300 and 800 yards. The 90mm gun proves decisively superior. T-34s that have dominated UN forces for weeks begin withdrawing when Pershings appear. The psychological advantage shifts, but Korea also exposes the Pershing's limitations. Its underpowered engine struggles in Korean terrain. Its weight makes it difficult to deploy over Korean bridges, many of which cannot support 46 tons. The Army begins developing the M46 and M47 Patton series, which incorporate Pershing designs with more powerful engines. The Pershing's arrival in 1945 raises uncomfortable questions about American tank development priorities. Why did it take so long? How many Sherman crews died in engagements where a Pershing would have survived? These questions lack satisfying answers because they implicate systemic failures in military bureaucracy, production philosophy, and strategic forecasting. General McNair's belief that tank destroyers could counter heavy armor proves inadequate. His death in July 1944, killed by friendly fire during Operation Cobra, removes the primary institutional obstacle to heavy tank development, but the delay costs lives. Comparing the Pershing to its contemporaries reveals both American pragmatism and missed opportunities. The Soviet IS-2 heavy tank, operational since 1944, mounts a 120 milliton gun and carries heavier armor than the Pershing. The British Centurion, entering service in May 1945, will serve effectively for decades. The Pershing exists in a middle space, better than what came before, adequate for its moment, but not revolutionary. Its 90mm gun is powerful, but not exceptional. Its armor is good, but not impenetrable. Its mobility is acceptable, but not impressive. It is a competent answer to an urgent problem, engineered under time pressure to meet battlefield necessity. The deeper legacy lies in what the Pershing taught American armor doctrine. First, technological parity matters. Courage and tactics cannot indefinitely compensate for equipment disadvantages. Second, crew confidence affects combat effectiveness. Tankers who believe their vehicle can protect them fight differently than tankers planning their escape routes. Third, the gap between peacetime doctrine and combat reality can be lethal. The belief that tank destroyers would handle enemy armor, while Shermans exploited breakthroughs, sounded logical in planning rooms, but failed on battlefields where Panthers ambushed from tree lines and Tigers anchored defensive positions. Perhaps most significantly, the Pershing represents a moment of institutional learning. The army that designed the Sherman in 1940 believed the next war would resemble the last war, emphasizing mobility and breakthrough rather than armor duels. The army that deployed the Pershing in 1945 had learned through painful experience that wars do not follow pre-war predictions. Equipment must adapt to battlefield realities, not the other way around. This lesson shapes post-war tank development. The M26 Patton incorporates Pershing experiences with better engines. The M48 addresses mobility issues. The M60 series continues the evolution. Each generation learns from the previous generation's combat deficiencies. But we must also acknowledge what the Pershing could not solve: the fundamental vulnerability of armored warfare. No tank is invincible. The Pershing could be destroyed by Panzerfausts, anti-tank mines, flanking shots, and mechanical failure. In Korea, rough terrain immobilized Pershings that enemy fire could then destroy at leisure. The psychological comfort of better armor sometimes created tactical overconfidence. Pershing crews occasionally engaged in direct confrontations that Sherman crews would have avoided, sometimes paying the price. Protection and firepower are not substitutes for tactical intelligence. Stand in Cologne today, near the cathedral that dominates the city center, and you can trace the path Pershing 26 took on March 6, 1945. The street corner where Maschlinik's crew encountered the Panther has been rebuilt. The scorch marks from that brief, violent engagement are long gone. The cathedral itself, damaged but never destroyed by Allied bombing, stands as a monument to both destruction and survival. It is a fitting metaphor for the men who fought in tanks on both sides. They sought to destroy each other while somehow surviving forces designed to obliterate them. The Pershing story is not about technological triumph or engineering superiority. It is about adequacy arriving in time to matter. It is about institutional systems learning, slowly and expensively, that pre-war assumptions do not survive contact with combat reality. It is about the men who climbed into the first 20 Pershings deployed to Europe, knowing these tanks were unproven, mechanically questionable, and urgently needed. They trusted their lives to machines fresh from assembly lines, with minimal testing, because those machines offered something their Shermans never did: a chance to fight German heavy armor without accepting death as the likely outcome. The laughter that German crews supposedly directed at early Pershing sightings, if it happened at all, died quickly. Not because the Pershing was invincible, but because it was sufficient. It carried a gun that could penetrate Tiger armor. It provided protection that could withstand 75mm rounds and some 88mm hits depending on angle and range. It gave American tankers the psychological foundation to advance rather than retreat when German heavy armor appeared. These are not small things. In warfare, the gap between hopelessly outmatched and fighting chance measures not just in millimeters of armor and calibers of guns, but in courage, morale, and the willingness to engage rather than evade. When Corporal Clarence Smoyer fired those two 90mm rounds into the Panther in Cologne, he was not just destroying an enemy tank. He was demonstrating that American industry and military adaptation could produce answers to battlefield problems. He was showing that courage, when properly equipped, could defeat technological superiority. He was proving that the men who died in Sherman's facing Tigers had not died because American engineering could not do better, but because American doctrine and bureaucracy had been too slow to recognize what battlefield commanders knew. Sometimes you need a bigger gun and thicker armor, and no amount of tactical flexibility compensates for inadequate equipment. The Pershing served in Korea, was modified and improved into the Patton series, and influenced American tank design philosophy for decades, but its real legacy is simpler and more human. It was the tank that told American crews they were no longer expected to die nobly in unequal fights. It was the moment American armor doctrine admitted that courage and numbers cannot indefinitely substitute for capability. It was the day the Wehrmacht realized that American industrial power, once properly directed, could produce not just more tanks, but better ones. The Tiger crews who laughed, if they laughed, stopped laughing when 90mm rounds started penetrating their supposedly impenetrable armor. They stopped laughing when Pershings began seeking out engagements rather than avoiding them. They stopped laughing when they realized the equation had changed, and American tankers were no longer climbing into coffins, but into machines that could fight back. That change, more than any battle statistics or kill ratios, is what mattered. It is what the men who crewed Pershings remember. It is what that footage from Cologne represents. It is the moment when American armored forces stopped compensating for equipment disadvantages and started fighting on level ground. And on level ground, against an enemy running out of fuel, ammunition, and territory, competent equipment in sufficient numbers is enough to win. The Pershing proved that. The men who fought in them lived that truth, and that, finally, is why it matters. What does it take to break an enemy who has conquered most of Europe? Not just defeat them in battle, but shatter their will so completely that veteran soldiers, men who had marched through Poland, France, and deep into Russia, would later say they had never experienced anything like it. The answer lies in a weapon system so devastatingly effective that it transformed modern warfare forever, yet remains largely unknown outside military circles. We're talking about American artillery in World War II. Specifically, the system of fire coordination, communication, and industrial might that turned the US field artillery into what German commanders quietly called the most lethal force on any battlefield. Today, we're going to explore how American gunners, many of them farm boys who had never seen a cannon before 1942, created a symphony of destruction so precise and overwhelming that it saved countless Allied lives and helped win the war in Europe. This is the story of innovation born from necessity, of mathematics meeting manufacturing, and of the moment when America's industrial soul found its most terrible expression on the battlefields of France and Germany. In the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the liberation of Europe, American military planners faced a sobering reality. The German Wehrmacht was the most experienced, battle-hardened fighting force in the world. German soldiers had been at war for 5 years. They had perfected combined arms tactics. Their NCOs and officers had survived campaigns across an entire continent. They were, by any measure, professional warriors, facing what they saw as amateur citizen soldiers. The Germans had particular confidence in their artillery. The legendary 80mm gun could destroy any tank the Allies fielded. German forward observers were skilled and aggressive. Their fire discipline was excellent. When German batteries spoke, they spoke with precision and economy. Each shell carefully aimed, each fire mission calculated for maximum effect with minimum expenditure. The Americans arrived in Europe with a different philosophy entirely. Where German doctrine emphasized precision and conservation, American doctrine emphasized volume and speed. Where Germans calculated, Americans overwhelmed. And at the heart of this philosophy was a revolution in how artillery was employed, a revolution so complete that it would change warfare itself. But here's the intriguing part that historians often miss. This wasn't just about having more guns or more shells, though America certainly had both. This was about creating an entirely new system, one that treated artillery batteries not as individual units, but as instruments in an orchestra, capable of massing fires from dozens of guns across vast distances onto a single target within minutes. The Germans had nothing comparable. No army in history had ever wielded artillery with such devastating coordination. The story begins not in Europe, but in the fields of Oklahoma and the proving grounds of Fort Sill, where the US Field Artillery School had spent the years between the wars quietly revolutionizing their craft. While isolationist sentiment kept America out of the war until 1941, forward-thinking artillery officers were studying reports from Spain, from China, from the early campaigns in Europe, learning what worked and what didn't. They identified a critical problem. Traditional artillery doctrine required forward observers to communicate with their own battery, which would calculate firing solutions and engage targets. If you needed more firepower, you had to go through cumbersome channels to request support from other batteries. The process was slow, hierarchical, and rigid. By the time reinforcing fires arrived, the target had often moved, or the tactical situation had changed. A group of officers, including men like General Leslie McNair, proposed something radical. What if any forward observer could call fire from any available battery? What if batteries were organized into battalions, battalions into groups, and groups into divisions, all capable of instantly massing their fires on any target? What if the artillery, rather than being parceled out to support individual infantry units, functioned as a single responsive weapon system? This idea faced enormous resistance. Traditional artillerymen argued it was impossible to coordinate. Infantrymen worried they would lose their guns. The logistics seemed nightmarish, but the reformers persisted, and by 1941, when America entered the war, the Field Artillery School had developed the doctrinal framework for what would become the most lethal artillery system ever deployed. The young men who would operate this system came from everywhere: farms in Iowa, factories in Michigan, small towns across Texas and Georgia. Most had never seen a 105mm howitzer before basic training. They learned to calculate firing solutions with slide rules and paper charts. They memorized radio procedures and forward observer protocols. They trained in the brutal heat of American summers, learning to work as teams where every man's role was essential and every second counted. The genius of American artillery doctrine rested on three revolutionary concepts that, when combined, created something far greater than the sum of their parts. First was the time on target, or TOT, fire mission. Instead of having shells arrive sequentially as each battery fired, TOT missions were calculated so that shells from multiple batteries, firing from different locations at different times, would all impact the target simultaneously. Imagine being a German soldier in a defensive position. You hear the whistle of incoming shells, not unusual in war. But then, instead of a few explosions followed by more incoming rounds, the entire world explodes at once. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of shells impact in a single devastating moment. There is no warning, no time to take cover. One instant you're in a fighting position, the next instant that position and everything around it simply ceases to exist. German veterans who survived TOT missions described them as psychologically devastating. They were used to artillery duels, to patterns of fire they could predict and endure. But American TOT fires were something else entirely. An overwhelming demonstration that nowhere was safe, that cover was an illusion, that the Americans could simply erase any position they chose. The second concept was truly revolutionary communications. The Americans deployed radio systems throughout their artillery network that, while primitive by today's standards, were leagues beyond what any other army possessed. Forward observers with frontline infantry units could communicate directly with fire direction centers miles behind the lines. These FDCs, staffed by specialists with calculating equipment, could plot firing solutions and coordinate multiple batteries in minutes. More importantly, they could access what the Army called Fire's Net, a system where any battery not currently engaged could be assigned to any mission, regardless of which unit technically controlled it. This meant that a company of infantry pinned down by German forces didn't just have the support of their battalion's artillery, they potentially had the support of every gun in range. A request for fire support might result in a single battery responding, or it might result in 10 batteries from 3 different divisions simultaneously engaging the target. The system was flexible, redundant, and incredibly fast. The third concept was industrial production meeting military necessity. America's factories produced shells in quantities that staggered the imagination. While German artillery battalions carefully rationed their ammunition, calculating the minimum expenditure necessary for each mission, American batteries operated under different mathematics entirely. If you needed a position suppressed, you didn't fire 10 shells carefully aimed. You fired 100 shells, ensuring that the target area was so saturated that survival became a matter of pure chance. This wasn't wasteful in American eyes. It was economical in the most important currency, the lives of American soldiers. Why risk infantry in a costly assault when you could simply destroy the enemy position from a distance? The American way of war in Europe became artillery first, infantry second. Pound the position into rubble, then occupy the ruins. When American forces landed at Normandy in June 1944, the German defenders initially viewed the American artillery with something approaching contempt. German after-action reports from the early weeks of the Normandy campaign note with satisfaction that American artillery seemed poorly coordinated, that individual batteries fired slowly compared to German guns, that American forward observers were inexperienced and easily suppressed. This German confidence lasted approximately 3 weeks. As American forces pushed inland and the artillery battalions fully deployed their systems, German units began reporting something they found difficult to believe. They were being engaged by what seemed like impossible numbers of guns. A German company commander would call for artillery support against an American position, and before his own guns could respond, American counter-battery fire would strike his artillery positions with devastating accuracy. German officers reported that American artillery seemed to be everywhere at once, that concentrations of fire appeared with shocking speed, that nowhere behind German lines was safe from American shells. What the Germans were experiencing was the American Fire Direction Center system in full operation. American counter-battery radar, another technological advantage, could track incoming German shells back to their source. Within minutes, the coordinates would be relayed to American FDCs, firing solutions calculated, and multiple batteries would engage the German guns. The German artillery piece that had fired would be destroyed before it could displace to a new position. something German doctrine called for, but increasingly became impossible to execute because the American response was simply too fast. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive of the war, American artillery fired over 500,000 shells in the first 3 days of combat. That's more shells than the entire German artillery arm in the Ardennes possessed. American batteries were firing at rates that German planners had believed physically impossible to sustain. Barrels wore out and were replaced. Ammunition trucks formed continuous convoys from supply dumps to firing positions. American gunners developed techniques to pour water on overheating barrels to cool them faster, allowing sustained rates of fire that exceeded manufacturer specifications. German commanders who had fought in Russia, who had experienced the massive Soviet artillery barrages that had ground down German positions through sheer weight of metal, reported that American artillery was worse. Not because the Americans fired more shells than the Soviets, though they often did, but because American fire was precise, responsive, and seemingly inexhaustible. Soviet artillery would announce itself with ranging shots, giving defenders time to take cover before the main barrage. American TOT missions gave no warning. Soviet artillery, once a barrage ended, would need time to reposition and resupply. American artillery never seemed to stop. There is a moral dimension to this story that demands examination. The American artillery system, for all its technological sophistication and tactical effectiveness, was fundamentally a tool for industrial-scale killing. We celebrate, and we should, the American soldiers who operated this system, who trained hard, who executed their duties with skill and courage. But we must also reckon with what this system represented: the mechanization of death, the reduction of combat to mathematics and logistics. German soldiers on the receiving end of American artillery barrages were not cartoon villains. Many were conscripts, serving a regime they may not have chosen, fighting because refusing meant death for themselves and their families. The shells that fell on them made no distinctions between the fervent Nazi and the reluctant draftee, between the war criminal and the boy from Munich who wanted nothing more than to survive and go home. American forward observers often reported the psychological difficulty of their work. They would call in fire missions, knowing exactly what would happen to the men in the target area. They would watch through binoculars as the shells impacted, as positions disappeared in smoke and flame, and then they would adjust fire and call in more shells. This was not the face-to-face combat of infantry work, where enemy and ally alike could be seen as human beings. This was abstract, distant, clinical. You read coordinates from a map, spoke into a radio, and people died by the dozens. Yet we must also consider the alternative. Every German position destroyed by artillery was a position that American infantry didn't have to assault. Every German battery silenced by counter-battery fire was a battery that wouldn't kill American soldiers. The grim mathematics of war suggested that overwhelming artillery was actually the more humane option. Humane to Americans, certainly, but perhaps even to Germans, since positions destroyed by artillery could at least offer the possibility of surrender, while positions assaulted by infantry often fought to the death. The British, who were Allied partners throughout the war, approached artillery differently. British doctrine emphasized careful, deliberate fire plans, often coordinated days in advance. British artillery barrages could be devastating, but they lacked the flexibility and responsiveness of the American system. British commanders sometimes criticized American prodigacy with ammunition, arguing that it was wasteful and showed poor fire discipline. The Americans responded that they were fighting a different kind of war. British forces, after years of attritional combat, were running out of manpower. Every British casualty was difficult to replace. The British approach to artillery reflected this reality. They needed precision because they couldn't afford waste. Americans, with a larger population and industrial base still ramping up, could afford to be profligate if it saved American lives. The debate between British precision and American volume reflects deeper questions about how democracies wage war, about what costs are acceptable, about whether efficiency should be measured in shells expended or lives preserved. In March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, the US field artillery reached the peak of its effectiveness. Fire direction centers could now coordinate not just dozens, but hundreds of batteries. Communication systems, refined through months of combat, functioned with near-perfect reliability. Forward observers, veterans now with a dozen battles behind them, could read terrain and anticipate enemy positions with uncanny accuracy. German defenders, by this point, had learned to fear American artillery above all else. German tactical manuals from late in the war instructed soldiers to disperse, to avoid concentrations, to keep moving, because any stationary position would inevitably be detected and destroyed. German commanders reported that American artillery fire made defensive operations nearly impossible. You couldn't mass forces for counterattacks without being struck, couldn't establish supply points without being shelled, couldn't even safely occupy defensive positions without constant fear of annihilation from the sky. The final numbers are staggering. American artillery in Europe fired more than 23 million shells during the war. American factories produced these shells faster than gunners could fire them. The system that had been theoretical in 1941 had become, by 1945, a perfectly functioning machine of destruction that no enemy could match or counter. But perhaps the most telling testament comes from the German soldiers themselves. After the war, when military historians interviewed captured German officers and enlisted men, asking them what aspect of Allied military power they feared most, the answer was nearly universal: American artillery. Not the tanks, not the air power, not even the overwhelming numbers of American troops. The artillery, the guns that never seemed to run out of ammunition, that struck without warning, that turned defensive positions into moonscapes, that made every moment of every day an exercise in survival against an enemy that could kill you from beyond the horizon. Those young American gunners, the farm boys from Iowa, the factory workers from Michigan, the small-town kids from Texas, had become the most lethal artillerymen in history. They had taken a system designed in the classrooms of Fort Sill and the proving grounds of Oklahoma and had forged it in the crucible of combat into a weapon that changed warfare itself. Every modern artillery doctrine in every NATO army today descends directly from what those American soldiers perfected in the fields and forests of France and Germany. They didn't do it for glory. Most artillery operations happened miles behind the front, unwitnessed by anyone except the crews themselves and the men on the receiving end. They did it because it was the mission, because their buddies in the infantry were counting on them, because someone had to do the difficult, dangerous, necessary work of war. The Germans had laughed in those early weeks after Normandy at American artillery. They had thought these amateurs with their abundance of equipment couldn't possibly match German skill and experience. They learned in the months that followed that war is sometimes not about skill, but about systems, not about individual excellence, but about collective effectiveness, not about fighting harder, but about fighting smarter. And they learned that when the shells started falling, they never ever stopped coming.